wouldn't start a camera review with a price comparison, but I think in the case of the Lumix S1RII, a lot of people aren't even familiar with the S1R, so let's set a bit of context. Now, looking at others that are comparable, like the Sony a7R5 and the Canon R5 II, if you were to put together a professional kit with an ultra-wide zoom lens, a standard zoom lens like a 24 to 70 millimeter 2.8, and let's say some kind of fast prime like a 35 millimeter, the Canon R5 II kit would be about $9,200. The Sony a7R5 kit would be $8,750. And for the Lumix S1R2 kit, it would cost $6,600. And now let's go through the basic feature list of the S1R2. It's got a 44.3 megapixel sensor, which means finally there is a Lumix that I can use for my professional photography work. It has phase hybrid detect autofocus, which was introduced in the S5 II, because if you don't know, Lumix used to have pretty mediocre autofocus. And right now I'm using it, so you can kind of judge it throughout this video, how well it's keeping track. I think it's generally improving every single model that they release. It's always one step behind the competitors, but they are definitely catching up. In burst mode, it can shoot 10 frames per second with a mechanical shutter and up to 40 frames per second electronic shutter. It has a dual native ISO, and that autofocus uses AI to detect humans, animals, vehicles, things like that. And it features the best image stabilization out of any of the camera brands I've tried. This will come up in video too, like it is superior on Lumix in every way. So let's do a classic vlog test. I feel like I don't use big cameras to record like this anymore because it's heavy, and so now I just use my iPhone for this sort of footage, but still, what does it look like? This is with just sensor stabilization, no electronic added to it. This is the new cropless mode, which effectively still gives you your full field of view with some electronic stabilization. And this is the standard electronic stabilization. Pretty good. I mean, this is better than some other cameras, even on high stabilization. Now let's crank it up. And here we go, high stabilization. I'm using the 18 millimeter right now, just to give you a sense. How does it look? Kind of hard to tell while I'm walking. You tell me in the comments below. And speaking of video, even though this camera is focused on photography, it has an amazing set of video features, including 8K, shooting proper vlog, rated up to 14 stops of dynamic range. I mean, that's Lumix's rating, but it's about as good as the Lumix S5 II, which I've been using in most of my YouTube videos for the last year. And maybe even better than 8K, it can also shoot open gate 6.4K, meaning if you want to crop a vertical composition, you've got all of the sensor to work with. It can record ProRes RAW internally, but also using the XLR adapter can do 32-bit float straight into the camera. And to accommodate all these features, it's got an SD and CF Express Type B card. So if you compare that feature set to the Sony and the Canon, what you could buy with the money you're saving is an additional 70 to 200 millimeter f4 lens for about $1,000, an 85 millimeter 1.8 lens for $500, 50 millimeter 1.8 lens for $300, and the new DMW BG2 battery grip for $350. That would all be the price of picking up the Sony or the Canon. I mean, that is a very compelling extra feature set for what is absolutely a comparable camera. So those are all the features on paper. They sound great, but I've got the camera here with me on this trip in Europe, so let's see what it looks like in the real world. Now let's take a moment to talk about where I got the music for this video and all my other videos. Today's sponsor, Artlist. By now, you must have heard of Artlist already. So many of your favorite creators are already using them. They have huge libraries of so many different tools, sound effects, AI voiceovers, video editing templates, LUTs. But maybe they're best known for their music. So I want to show you how I use their website to discover hidden gems in their massive collection. I usually start by clicking on the music tab where I can start browsing, and then I use genre to narrow it down to the overall world that I'm looking for. For this video, it's obviously classical. So then I start listening to different songs, and one new feature I really appreciate is they kind of jump ahead to the catchy part of the song. Like, this is the interesting part. So so you don't have to listen through all of each song, because usually I'm going to skip around quite a bit. But notice that the default sort order is staff picks, which are great, but I like to jump to newest, and then I'm introduced to the latest songs in their collection. So these are completely undiscovered. You'll notice a lot of them are completely new, and this way I can be the first one to use a specific song in my videos. And if I like the overall feeling of a song, but it's not exactly what I want, I often use this similar songs feature, which brings down a list of similar music, and sometimes I could just scatter these throughout my video and I've got a whole soundtrack. And to go up here to the right, they've got filters, so you can narrow this down even more, and often I'll click on instrumental because I don't want the vocals overlapping with my narration. And if you're a Final Cut Pro editor like me, you can install the Artlist Hub. I just discovered this, and there are all these plugins that are available to you as an Artlist member to have a whole ton of special effects and filters available to you all the time. Their selection of creative assets is amazing. So check out the link in the description, and thanks again to Artlist for supporting this video. I got more into Lumix when they sent me their S5 II to review, and before that, I wasn't really paying any attention to them, which I'm gonna assume most of you watching aren't either. Like, Lumix is not leading the industry in terms of sales, but I do think they're one of the most interesting companies going on, and after they sent me that camera, I started using it a lot. So the last year, I've been shooting tons of my video on it, anything that was basically running gun. If I was loading it on a gimbal or traveling, a lot of that was the S5 II. Canon has been my primary camera system for years now, the C70 for video and the R5 for photo. And they just didn't have a great hybrid solution. Now, they did release some amazing updates with the R5 II, but I was really hesitant to pull the trigger on it because I had a feeling something like this might be coming from Lumix. So the fact that there is a high resolution option in the S1RII changes the decision-making I have to do. So, can Lumix handle a professional photo workflow? Well, they pretty much resolved autofocus. It is just a non-issue for me anymore. It may not be perfect. I haven't quite tested it enough to know if it's at the same level as my Canon, but it doesn't get in my way at all. It does not miss focus much. Even with the S5 II, it was already pretty close to being fully workable. So I'm satisfied with where it is, and it keeps getting better. Lumix is amazing at updating firmware, so I have a feeling it will improve over time. Looking at the image quality, it's fantastic. I kind of thought it was gonna be the same sensor as the Leica SL3. It seems like Lumix was waiting for something different so that the video quality wouldn't have to be compromised at all, which amazingly it isn't. But the photos are crazy sharp, tons of dynamic range, and Lumix does have really great default color science. Of course, I'm never really using the default colors out of any camera, but the raw images coming out of this Sony sensor have tons of latitude, lots of room for adjusting in post, and they look great. Let's go on a tour of the S1RII because I think it's got some really fantastic usability features. I've always found Lumix easy to use, easier than Sony generally, kind of in the same class as Canon. And I don't want to bury the lead here. This is the absolute best thing. This flip screen is where it's at. So you can be looking down, have this perspective. You can flip it out if you're vlogging. You can flip it back. You have all of the flipping options, similar to what Sony did on the A7R5. This is what a flip screen should be, especially this one. Like, if you're shooting video, you want to have the alignment of having the screen right behind the lens. But then, hey, I shoot a lot of vertical too, and it means that you can flip it like this. This is everything. It gives you all the options. I love it. And while we're on the side here, I like that they split out all of the different ports. You got full-size HDMI, USB-C, headphone, and mic, but they're all hidden behind their own little compartments, so you don't have to open a giant flap of rubber. You can just access exactly the one that you're using. If you saw my review of the S5 II, this dial accidentally was getting flipped all the time, and I'm glad that they've just moved it back enough that it hasn't been happening. Definite improvement there. Also, these dials on top lock, so you press it once and now it won't change until you press it again. We've seen this on other cameras before, but it's very helpful to have there. A little bit more of a pro feature. There's one new setting that I'm really grateful for. Now, Lumix gives you the option, when you remove the lens, of keeping the shutter closed. I've complained about this in the past. I think this is the right default. Lumix still has it open by default, so you have to go in settings to do this, but it just keeps so much less dust on it. Canon, by default, closes the shutter like this. And I just think it's appropriate because I'm much more worried about things getting in there on the sensor than damaging the shutter. Obviously the shutter's sensitive, so you gotta be careful as well, but it just keeps my photos a little cleaner. The overall buttons and joystick and everything is pretty chunky, which I appreciate. When you press that, you can really feel that you're pressing it. The only one I don't love is this dial. Is a little lighter
than the rest. The other dials feel a little bit stronger, but that's small detail. One thing I've always praised Canon for is that the buttons don't need to be reassigned and customized a whole lot. That's something I dislike about Sony, is that often people have a complete custom setup, but you really just kind of leave it the way that it is. The one change if you're using a Lumix is that I would assign this back dial to control the ISO, otherwise it's kind of doing nothing by default. Now there is this dedicated dial to switching between photo, video, and S&Q mode so that you can quickly be in exactly what you want, and settings are retained as you move through them. We've got 3 record buttons around the camera. So there's one here, the shutter button can also record, as well as the front here. So it is always easy to get started. And I really appreciate that there is a tally light both on the front and on the back of the camera, so you always know what's going on. I don't know why every camera isn't doing this by now, but it's still missing from some of the other prominent hybrid cameras.
One thing that's been a hurdle if you wanted to use Lumix as your photography system is a lack of tethering support. You can only really use Panasonic software to do that. Now, Capture One is working with Lumix to have full support of tethering and RAW files. The nice side effect of that is that for this video, I was able to actually work with RAW files, where most of the time when I'm reviewing a camera before it's released, I can only look at the JPEGs. Now let's talk about lenses for a second. When I was shooting the S5 II, it's only 24 megapixels, so it's really not pushing these lenses at all. So now that I'm on a 44 megapixel sensor, I can see the detail a lot more. The zoom lenses, like the 24-105 and the 16-35, which is Leica certified, are excellent, very sharp all around. They have been great performers. And I always loved the way Lumix did their prime lenses. So they're all basically the same size, 67mm threads, so you could just switch NDs between them. Similar weight, similar length, so if you're switching lenses on a gimbal, they all fit. Their prime lenses were all optimized for video. But now I can kind of tell when I'm taking photos, especially in the corners. They are not as sharp in the corners as the zoom lens. The center is totally fine. So, I'm shooting on it right now. This is all tack sharp, and in video, those edges usually get cropped out anyway. So if you want edge-to-edge sharpness for your photos, I'd recommend taking a look at the Sigma I series of lenses. They do appear to be sharper all around the corners. I haven't tried them yet, but just this is based on other reviews. And hey, look at this. They're also releasing a new app called Lumix Flow. It does a lot of different things, including storyboarding your whole shoot. But what I'm using it for right now is as a monitor. So I've got my iPhone right on top of the camera, and it just has a USB cable running into it. It can't do wireless monitoring yet. Maybe someday, that'd be great. But just being able to run a simple USB-C cord is way more effective than having external accessories or a whole external monitor. I'm only ever gonna bother using my iPhone from now on because it's got a built-in battery, the screen is great, and it's already in my pocket. I knew eventually Lumix would get around to a high megapixel photo focused camera, but I don't think I expected just how hard they would go on making those video features amazing. Shouldn't be surprising now because Lumix always does this. They focus on hybrid and they never leave video behind. So this does shoot up to 8K, 8.1K even. There's a bunch of little exceptions about how you can shoot different log versions in different resolutions. Some have very small crop modes, but everything's almost full frame, and that's great for me. It was the biggest thing that held me back with the S5 II, is I couldn't shoot slow motion. So on that, even 60 frames per second would crop into something like APS-C. So now, not only can we shoot 60 frames per second, full frame, but also 120 frames per second, full frame, and all of this video looks great. It doesn't seem like it's from a photography camera. Like, this works as a full-on hybrid camera. If I could only bring one with me out of any camera I owned, this would kind of have to be it, because it does it all so well. So it does shoot ProRes RAW internally, which is very impressive, but it's not a feature I'm going to use a lot, because I just find that the regular H.264 or MOV files are more than enough quality. I'm usually shooting in Vlog, and I've got a set of Lumix LUTs. The link is available down below if you want to pick them up. And they provide so much flexibility and dynamic range out of these files. There are a few weird exceptions about Vlog where some resolutions don't have quite as much dynamic range. So I'm just leaving it at the setting to always have 14 stops, and I'll just choose a resolution that supports maximum dynamic range because I don't want to throw any away. And the results look amazing. And applying the Stalman Lumix Transform LUT preserves all of that detail. I think it looks fantastic. Also, we can't talk about Lumix without also talking about stabilization, because this is what they are amazing at. They have more room for their sensor to move around than any of the other brands, which means that the sensor stabilization is incredibly strong. Even if the lens you're using doesn't have OIS built into it, it doesn't need both to be extremely stable. Now, especially for video, if you turn on the E-stabilization, either to the new cropless mode, or standard, or high, they all look great. With high, you can really comfortably just walk with this. I mean, I don't know if I'd run, but it gets rid of a lot of the warpy lines in the corners, and it just looks excellent as you're walking around. When I switched to Lumix, I started using gimbals a lot less. Especially for B-roll, you can kind of just like hold it and move around left to right, and it stabilizes it better than you'd expect. One new detail when you're shooting in vlog that I think is worth pointing out is the base ISO is now 400 instead of 640. So it means that you don't need as strong of an ND, or you can just shoot in brighter light with a wider open aperture. Lower ISOs are always helpful for this kind of thing. So how should we think about the S1RII? Well, first of all, the value is undeniable. As I started this video with, you can get so much more out of a Lumix system for the same price. I don't know that it's necessarily better than what Canon and Sony are offering right now, because the R5 II is amazing, so is the A7R5, but this just costs quite a bit less. When you decide what to buy, it's about a lot more than just that camera body. It's about the whole ecosystem of the brand that you're going with. So the S1R is filling a professional photography shaped hole in the Lumix lineup. Now what I'm really excited for is to see what they can do with the professional cinema camera. That's all for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one.